Hi, comrade. Welcome to our podcast series. These episodes feature the best of Lab-Left, an international forum organized by Szikra Movement in collaboration with Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. We gathered in Budapest in November 2024 in order to discuss how to win from the left. Thanks for tuning in. The Homes for All panel focused on housing and tenant organizing. It featured Ewan McKean and Cameron Scally from Living Rent Scotland. Enikő Vince from Romania represented the European Action Coalition. Balint Misetic represented Cities for All, the Budapest municipality. The moderator was Ivan Merker. So we're here with Ivan Merker, one of the co-organizers of Lab-Left and the moderator of the Housing for All panel. How do you feel about the panel?
I think it was really interesting. I really enjoyed the panel. I really enjoyed meeting some new people, Ewan and Cameron, and also to be able to meet Enikő again, whom I've actually met once online. But I have never met her before in person, so I'm really happy that I was able to meet her. And of course, it's always good to talk to Balint.
It was often there's the impression that East and Western Europe are very different. For example, in regards to housing, they obviously came from very different contexts. Did you still feel they managed to talk with each other and find common ground and tactics?
I think so. I mean, this was one of the most important questions at the end of the panel, and some of the panelists were just generally skeptical of how efficiently you can work together internationally on housing, because I think they feel it's a very local issue. But I think there are a lot of parallels between what Ewan and Cameron from Scotland is saying versus Balint, who was from Budapest, and Enikő, who was from Cluj. I mean, historical tendencies such as privatization of housing are obviously similar, both in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And for example, the UK, it happened to roughly the same era as in Hungary or Romania. So I think there were definitely parallels, while of course there are also differences.
I think when you mentioned that privatization of the housing stock took place in the UK roughly at the same time as in Eastern Europe, you underline that even though there are big divides in our histories, there's lots that unites it. And often in the readings of even Cold War history, we see an accent based on the divides, but there's obviously larger scale processes that happen globally as well.
Yes, and for example, trends like neoliberalization that started in the UK and the US crept into Hungary actually even before the fall of the communist regime. So it's not even only after 1989, and often these were explicitly modeled on Western European and American models, not only in housing but in housing as well. This was for example, Thatcherite neoliberalism was the model that the post-89 Hungarian state was aiming to replicate. And this is also true of other nations around Eastern Europe.
What was interesting as well is how far-ranging the conversation was. It went from concrete tactics, strategies, canvassing, then to questions of how does the European Parliament try to act for the good in this context. So that was also interesting for me. You're someone who's been involved in housing issues for quite a long time. You also work for a housing organization at the moment. Anything that surprised you or was unexpected?
I think for me the most interesting bit was that talking to you and Cameron from Scotland, that they their organization model, that they were able to create a mass housing movement, mass membership housing movement, somewhat like a trade union. It's a rental union. And also, I think this is something that is unfortunately missing from the housing movement in Hungary, is that there isn't enough focus on the private tenant. So I think this is an issue in Hungary, that like a lot of people live in precarious private housing or very expensive private housing, but I think the housing movement is oftentimes not focusing enough on their situation.
Thanks for this. And it's also interesting to have listened to this panel in relation to other panels, because housing issues came up also in the local powers panel, but also in the trade union panel, and even in the Green Eastern Europe panel, where the question of housing for ex-miners was a very salient feature. So this just goes to prove that housing is very much at the center of any emancipatory project. Thanks, Ivan.
Thank you.
Városi tornyok most oly némán álltunk, boldogságra, virágcsokorra várunk.
My private, like in my life, I work at a housing NGO called From Streets to Homes Association, and let me introduce the panel. So to my left, we have Bálint Misetic, a long-term housing activist for Budapest, Hungary, and an advisor on housing to the mayor of Budapest. Second here is Enikő Vince. He's a professor of sociology at Babes-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca, Romania, a housing activist at Social Housing Now in Cluj, as well as involved in the European Action Coalition as well. And to my right, the two guys here are Ewan McLennan, head remote organizer at Living Rent Scotland, and Cameron Scully, the Leith branch chair of Living Rent Scotland. They are representing Living Rent from Scotland. And originally we were advertising that Aydin Dikerdem will join this panel. Unfortunately, his flight was cancelled, so he's not able to be here right now. But hopefully he will be able to come to Budapest today and join the panel in the at the afternoon on local government. So friends and fans of Aydin need not worry. First of all, I would like to ask all of you to briefly introduce yourselves in more detail and explain your housing activism. So maybe if Cameron, you can explain Living Rent for us, and then you can just add your specific and your work as well at Living Rent, and then you can just add what exactly you're doing.
Everyone, just hold it up. There we go. My mic technique needs some work. So I am Cameron. I am the branch chair of Leith, a neighbourhood branch in the city of Edinburgh. The housing crisis within Edinburgh in particular is largely related to the national crisis that we're facing in Scotland, which I think Ewan will speak about in a little bit more detail. In Edinburgh, that's mostly manifesting in ever-increasing rents, and it's largely driven by most of our development being centred around purpose-built student accommodation. This is large-scale developments which only serve mostly visiting students and extract a great deal of money from them without providing any mainstream housing at all. We have made some significant developments, made some significant progress in our broader city campaigns around sort of over-tourism that we've been facing, particularly housing moving towards short-term lets and Airbnbs. But recently we have achieved significant changes in development guidelines, which mean that citywide it will become much more difficult for private developers to push through purpose-built student accommodations.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here with you and this really great event this weekend and in Budapest here. My name's Ewan McLennan, and I'm a staff organiser with Living Rent, the Tenant and Community Union, the same organisation as Cameron. And Cameron has described the situation in Edinburgh, the city, the capital of Scotland, a little bit there. And the situation in the country in general is quite similar in many ways. It is private rented accommodation is very expensive in a lot of places. The rent is going up fast. But in an interesting way, it also kind of mirrors the job market at the moment in that it's incredibly insecure. So people don't feel like they've got the chance to stay in a flat for a long time, perhaps. They don't know whether themselves and their families might be asked to move soon. And that creates a lot of instability in people's lives. So that's in the rental kind of sector. Council housing is way down from what it was just a few decades ago. There's a relatively small proportion of people now in council housing. About 24% of the population in Scotland live in council or social accommodation. And a lot of that is really poor quality, very damp, mouldy, lots of disrepair, that kind of thing. So that's some of the situation we're dealing with in Scotland on a national level. In terms of some of the things that we've achieved, just really quickly, to kind of add some excitement to that bad picture, during lockdown, we managed to win, and we'll talk a wee bit more about this later on today, but we managed to win an eviction ban to stop people being thrown out their homes, and we managed to win temporary rent freeze to stop rents rising. That was temporary, and so the big thing that we're doing now at a national level is trying to win permanent rent controls, and that is currently going through the Scottish Parliament, and we're quite hopeful that there's a good chance that in 6, 7, 8 months' time we will have those permanent rent controls in place, which is a big step forward and almost unthinkable 4, 5, 6 years ago. Thanks.
Annika, and as you just mentioned, if you can also give us an example of something you're proud of or one of your achievements as an activist, that's also great. But also explain social housing now as well as the European Action Coalition and your work in these organizations, please.
Köszönöm a meghívást. Angolul fogok beszélni. I'm very happy to be here from one of the East Central European countries, former state socialist countries, which kind of went through similar changes since 1990. We had a significant amount of state-owned and public housing, which decreased in the past more than 3 decades below 2% in Romania, for example. So I would say that the housing crisis in my country is actually evolving around these changes, capitalist transformations in the country. We are a super home ownership country still, but this does not mean that each person who owns a home is rich or is having good housing conditions. Additionally, in the big cities, including Cluj, Napoca, Kolozsvár, where I am acting, are having or are displaying an increase in the private rental sector. So students and young generations, early career professionals, workers belonging to different labor classes are faced with the increasing rent and increasing housing prices. So this is a new development in the housing crisis in the country, which again affects different social categories differently. As far as institutional landlords are concerned, so we are totally different than core capitalist countries in this sense. We don't have big landlords, corporate landlords in the residential sector, but we have global real estate developers and investment funds who are present in other real estate sectors, such as retail and office buildings, but also in mixed-use development. So recently, especially in the context of the current rise of mortgages and indebtedness of people, actually experts foresee that the housing market will slowly change. So people will not afford anymore to buy a home, but they will be forced to enter into the private rental market because we really lack public housing. About our movement, or maybe I can tell later about that, or it's here.
I think it's the best time to explain about both social housing now and also EAC as the work they do.
Yeah. So, but still, I need to say that our local movement, Social Housing Now, started as a series of actions against forced eviction of Roma people. Therefore, our housing movement has also a strong anti-racist component, and the activist group since 2015 support impoverished Roma people, but not only, but mostly to submit their social housing request documents yearly. And recently we started to find ways to support tenants' mobilization. In what regards the European Action Coalition for the Right to Housing and to the City, it has grassroots organizations from members from 20 countries. It's a very, very different context. Western, Northern, East, Central European countries. But we have in common the fact that we do militant research to support activists in their struggles. And we do some joint events. The most famous is maybe the Housing Actions Day, which that the coalition organizes yearly in March. Next year it will go on in April, when all the grassroots movements organize locally something around their specific topics, but under a common umbrella. In addition, the coalition also tries to put pressure on real estate developers. For example, it organized actions when the MIPIM meeting in Cannes, of one of the biggest international meetings of developers, happens in Cannes. And because we think that, we have to pressure the state and also the European Commission, as we speak of Europe, to create economic policies which would allow access to all the people to housing, so housing for people, not for profit. But they also have to put pressure on the financial actors and real estate developers and investors who actually, together with the states, create this housing crisis that we are all faced with.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thanks for the invitation and for the organizers. Well, the Hungarian context, very briefly, as far as housing or the housing crisis is concerned. So in 1990, because Hungary is also a post-socialist country, every second housing unit was state-owned or council-owned, and now it's only 4%. So the extremity of the privatization policies pursued in the early 90s would make Margaret Thatcher seem like, careful, decent, center-left type of politician. Which, of course, also gives us the first important element of the contemporary context, which is an extremely low proportion of social housing or affordable rental in the city. The other important part, I suppose, is the extreme informality of the private rental sector. The regulation is already extremely liberal, I suppose, in an international comparison, but even the existing rules is hard to enforce. So it is a very insecure position for the most part to be a tenant, unless you, of course, a tenant of a relative you have or a friend you have with housing wealth. That makes things much easier. And third, since 2010, we have here. Well, I mean, I don't have, but the country has like an authoritarian-ish far-right government. the social policy of which could be characterized as pro-capital, anti-welfare state, and also focusing on what could be described as like a selective pronatalism, which means that, for example, in terms of housing, they would have quite generous housing support, but only for housing purchases, only for families with children, and the regulations would make sure that the more well-educated you are, the more income you have, the more secure labor market position you have, the more housing wealth you already have, the more likely you are to access these supports, and the more likely it is that you would be able to access them in a higher amount, because they would want to support Hungarian families to have more children, but not for the poor, and especially not for the Roma Hungarians, I suppose. So this is the brief context. We also have a quite severe homelessness crisis in the city. And I would also need to introduce myself, right, or the organization. And so I have been involved in housing-related activism and community organizing since 2004 or 5. And since 2009, we've been involved in an organization called A Város Mindenkié, the City is for All. The essential purpose of which was to create a grassroots community organizing infrastructure which would allow people with direct experience of homelessness to engage in the public life and to be empowered to speak out, and so that not other people would speak on behalf of homeless people or people living in housing poverty, but these people themselves. And this was the main focus, I suppose, of the organization for around 10 years. And in the past years, however, we have been mostly focusing on anti-eviction work, especially but not exclusively from whatever have remained from as council housing. So
Okay, so Balint already mentioned membership, and I have a question for Cameron this time on organizing on a national Scotland-wide level. So most housing organizations, certainly those both of Annikes and Balint, tend to focus on individual cities, Cluj or Budapest in these cases, but you organize on a national Scotland-wide level. So how can you organize for this issue nationally?
That's a really useful question for the way that we organize, because most people won't experience housing as an individual issue. They will experience individual aspects which affect them. The apartment upstairs has been turned into an Airbnb party flat. Their landlord barges into their door at a moment's notice. And what we do is we engage with people on the issues that already affect them. We bring them in, and then from that point, we are able to help them link together all these individual issues and develop an understanding of the housing issue itself. And that's how we structure ourselves as well. So Living Rent functions as this constellation of neighborhood level branches which are able to organize autonomously, and then with the help of national level member-led decision making and staff like Ewan, we are able to bring these different struggles together and work at a national level.
Can you tell me numbers on? So can you tell me a couple of numbers on how many local branches you have and how many members?
I'm not sure how many local branches we have. I think in recent years we have been growing particularly quickly. So that now in Edinburgh we went from 1 to 2 branches from 2020 to 2021. We now have 4 branches in Edinburgh, each with hundreds of people within them. So I think within Edinburgh, about 2,000 members. Nationally, are closer to 5,000-6,000, would you say?
It's about 4,500 somewhere between that and 5,000 members nationally. But it's growing quite fast. Neighbourhood branches, we have 8 neighbourhood branches, and those are based in Glasgow and Edinburgh exclusively. But we also have groups, which is a slightly smaller version of a fully formed branch. And we have those in different cities all around Scotland, as well as some in Glasgow and Edinburgh too. So,
yeah, I think that raises the question of how to. So when you're organizing for housing, how you can build a political momentum and around housing issues, and that leads us to the question, as Ewan and Cameron mentioned, of mobilizing people around housing. So if Balin and Danica, you could explain us a bit of your tactics of mobilizing people around this issue, including people who may not themselves be experiencing housing poverty or the housing crisis. For example, they have a stable... in Hungary, like a lot of people are able to live in their own house and may not have a direct experience of the housing market for this reason. But how can you, for example, mobilize those people, and how you can create organizations that are able to mobilize large social coalitions around issues of housing, including from homeless people to I think in AVM you call them allies, so people who feel solidarity with homeless or people living in housing poverty. So how can you create like these mobilized coalitions that can then be used for organizing? I think this was a clear question.
One and only question. Thank you. Yes. So I would say for us, this is a matter of a process. So how we tried to build political solidarity around housing crisis during the past 15 years. As I already said, the movement in Cluj was a consequence of a revolt against a dramatic group eviction. More than 70 Roma families in wintertime, and their relocation to the near the landfill of the city. So people who were affected by that eviction, and some people from the city, including myself, from the university mostly, but not only, could come together in the support of the struggle of people who are directly affected by these evictions, and therefore the role of those who were outside, in a way more privileged, but still revolted against what's happening in the city and against these housing injustices and environmental racism also in our case. So we tried to translate people's lived experiences into political messages, which we took towards decision makers by different means, like organizing street demonstrations, going into court litigations, conducting campaigns to raise awareness about the severity of this issue. And what we could observe in time, so yearly, for example, we organize these commemorative events in December. And there were a lot of people affected by evictions, not only the 2010 ones, but other evictions as well. And obviously, we tried to mobilize others from the city. Some came, and at a point, the movement started to grow. But we observed that the fact that somehow people associated our actions with impoverished Roma people and their needs for social housing, made many other social categories not participate. I'm not saying that racism is everywhere, but it was a kind of shame, for better off people, a little bit better off people, to admit publicly that they also have a housing issue, right? So this is a moment in our organizing when we tried to expand our political messages, and generally for public housing for larger social categories, and also against this urban development for profit, which affects urbanistic evolutions in the city, and there is a kind of unrest around that general issue. So we tried to figure out which would be the shared points of interest of different social categories, including tenants, right? Because we are a university city, and there are many tenants from the private sector. And also this issue of the rising housing, not only housing costs, but living costs, the energy crisis. So we tried to organize events around all these issues connected to housing, right? So this was one of our ways, but this was not just a strategy, so to speak, but it was the way in which we understood that the problems changed in the past 15 years. So the movements also have to change and to adapt their strategies and actions to the changing realities. One of the most important challenges in this context for us, for all the activists, I guess, is how to stop to being only reactive, so only running after problems when they already occurred, and how can we imagine some alternative futures and act for their fulfillment. But maybe about this we can speak about later.
So I suppose in our case, as the main focus was the most severe type of housing deprivation, homelessness. That's a particular social issue because even though at any given time it affects less people directly as other types of poverty or housing deprivation and so on, it is in a certain way much more visible than other social problems. So it is not so much that you would need to raise awareness about homelessness because people would already be aware, but that you would need to allow them to facilitate to think about homelessness in another way. And I think this is where the messaging and the kind of political and sociological understanding that the group cultivated about homelessness, and the fact that in those 10 years, all public speakers, for example, of our groups would be people with direct experience of homelessness, created some sort of a synergy because at least here, but I think this is a common issue in many European countries, there is this compulsive association in the social construction of homelessness between someone without a housing and the homeless shelter. So it's like homeless person, homeless shelter, sick person, hospital, guilty person, prison, I don't know, young person, school. So that kind of compulsive association, which really makes it impossible to talk about the key issue, which is affordable housing, about homelessness as well. And I think that resonated. But the reason why it resonated well, because it was represented not only, but also not predominantly by I don't know, left-wing intellectuals or sociologists, but people who no one could have said that they don't know what they're talking about, because they were the only people who really knew what they were talking about. So it was in a way like a politics of needs interpretation, so that, okay, no one would discuss or debate that homelessness needs to be dealt with, but like how? Like, is it a winter issue when it's cold, or is it a housing issue? So I think that did resonate well with people, partially because, in fact, Hungarian societies, I mean, the society itself is much less anti-poor and anti-welfare state and anti-equality than the political ruling class. So from a few years ago, we have data on how people view evictions without the provision of something else, like evictions to the street. And like a large majority is, regardless of political affiliation, think that that's just not right. However, evictions are routinized, and therefore, it's this otherwise existing preference doesn't have any edge or any practical relevance. However, if from time to time there are a group of people, including activists from Szikra, in these past years, who commit civil disobedience against evictions, then that allows the public to, well, it actually forces the public to be exposed to that kind of violence that depriving someone of his or her home is. But however, for 99% of the cases, is just like hidden in these vague procedural roles of court executions and whatnot. So in a way, I think, and this is an advantage of us, I mean, broadly understood left or I don't know, people concerned and working towards social justice, that in most societies, there are a lot of social injustices that like if people were exposed to their true nature, like that would not fit well with their worldviews and preferences. But this kind of unveiling of hidden structural violence needs to be done. And you also asked us at some point to refer to tactics. We thought and we experienced that civil disobedience, especially as far as like human blockades against evictions are concerned, are very efficient. Well, for the most part, that's why we're doing it. That they're efficient in preventing evictions, of course, but they are efficient in exposing that kind of raw violence that is going on. And then, people don't like it.
Thank you. We actually slid a little bit into my next question, which is good. So for the next question, I will mainly ask from Ewan, because you haven't touched on this, is on tactics and of creating pressure on government actors, including local government, that leads to the change in housing policy, or change in, for example, eviction law, or change in how the state treats poor people, as in the case of Balin's examples. So what are your tactics of creating pressure?
I think when we start a campaign around a certain issue, perhaps on housing, we would look at trying to develop a whole different range of tactics to be putting pressure on the local government or the national government, for example. To kind of go through a few of those. One of the things that we have been using in recent years is consultations, and the national government and our city authorities as well are very, very keen on consultations, and they're usually a little bit meaningless, and they give people no real chance to take part in the political process. But we've been kind of spinning them slightly, and instead of the expectation being that a very small number of people fill out these incredibly technical consultations, we've been getting huge numbers of people to fill them out, which has been surprising to authorities. And we've often been doing that by kind of summarizing the consultations and the technical questions in them, and saying, this is our position on the consultation, and giving a kind of a brief summary, would you agree with it? And getting a lot of people to fill it out in that kind of way. That's been quite an interesting way to make sure that authorities can't ignore the people's interests or people's views on these matters. It's also quite a good way to get these things in the press, in the media. And I think that press and media angle has been another really important way of us putting pressure on authorities, because often their reputations are not good at a local level, but they do still care about their reputations and they don't want to be in the media. And so we've been using local press and national press quite a lot as well to try and put pressure on them. And a key way that we do this, particularly around housing, is by using testimony, what we call testimony, which is basically just the personal experience of people who are suffering from whatever the issue is. So it might be, for example, a family that have been facing eviction, and that personal experience of them in the press with photos and so on, it does, I think, similar to what you're saying, it brings it to the attention of people in a way that they find it hard to ignore. And a way that I think puts a certain amount of shame or pressure on some of the politicians or officials that we're trying to reach. So I think the comms is a different angle as well. A third kind of tactic that we use is protest or direct action. And there's a bit of a spectrum here. Sometimes that might be trying to mobilize as many of our members and people in our communities as possible, and to turn up outside government buildings with banners, with placards, in busy places where this suddenly becomes something that people have to confront and engage with. Sometimes it can be something a little bit more towards the direct action. So, for example, there was a nice campaign in Glasgow a while back, to give you a brief story, where there was huge amounts of rubbish piling up on the streets. Communities were very dirty, particularly the ones that were poorer, and the council wasn't, giving the adequate kind of cleaning services. So a campaign was taken on, and they gathered all the rubbish up in that local area, and they put it in a very visible part of that community, right next to a big park, to try and get the attention of the council. That didn't work. So they then got 3 different communities from around the city to gather up all the rubbish in their local area. They loaded it into vans, and they drove it down to the city chambers where the council sits, where the council works. And they dumped it right on the doorstep, outside the front doors of the council. And they had the media down there. They had lots of members protesting. And this worked really well. And it ended up getting a guarantee from the council after a negotiation to invest £2 million more in the cleaning services for those communities. So that's a little bit of an example of another kind of tactic that we use. And I think a lot of the time in these campaigns, it's bringing these different tactics together. Just very briefly as well, you talked of allies before, and I think that's something else that we do draw on quite a lot. So, for example, in that campaign in Glasgow around street cleaning, we worked with the union of bin workers. And so often we will have allies in these campaigns as well that can help to put extra pressure on the people in power.
Thank you. Turning back to this side of the panel, you'll have a chance to answer as well. I think, Annika, you already brought this issue up slightly. We see that housing is becoming an electoral issue, in the sense that more and more politicians talk about housing, like Kamala Harris was talking about housing. Currently in Hungary, the government is now trying to suddenly realize that there's a housing crisis, as if people like Balint haven't been talking about it for like decades now, 15 years, I don't know. Or like my the organization where I work at as well. And if it's telling, I feel like, oh my God, like they started to realize this, that we're saying like 10 years, whatever. So we see that housing is becoming an electoral issue, but you also see that it's, in my opinion, unfortunately, it's often becoming an electoral issue in a right-wing frame. So, for example, Kamala Harris was talking about deregulation, and that would allow there must be a phrase here that I can't remember, but around market forces to flood the market with new units, and that would, based on the invisible hand, bring down prices. But I mean, of course, we're not fighting for that. We're fighting for social housing for everyone. Like social housing now, as Annika's organization's name says, and I think as we all agree. So my question is, how can you ensure that when housing becomes an electoral political issue or an issue in the high echelons of politics, it's also a left-wing issue. And it's understood in a left-wing frame as a right to housing and a social housing for everyone, rather than in the right-wing frame as a demand issue, or like a demand and supply issue where you need to deregulate the supply side and then everything will be happy and sunshiny. So yeah, that's what I'm asking you, if you can give me an answer, and I think you can start with Annika.
So we are in a paradoxical situation, I guess. Theoretically, we must be happy for this political momentum in which different actors at different levels, local, national, global, are expressing their concerns about the housing crisis. But still, we have doubts about their reasons and about ways in which they define the problem, the causes of the problem, and they look for solutions. I guess that this political momentum is also about a new moment for state and transstatal actors to think how to support the housing market, how to support real estate developers and investors in this critical moment that we are now in: economic recession, geoeconomic wars, and so on and so forth. So personally, my biggest doubt is that these political actors actually would like to save again the capital invested in real estate, but still pretend, at least discursively, that they are thinking about people's interests. So this would be actually what Ivan said, I guess. What is the line between the left-oriented political thinking and solutions to the housing crisis and those solutions which are defined on the right-wing politics. If I'm looking nowadays what's happening in the European Commission, for example, with this new European plan for affordable housing, I see the same problem. So they want to solve a large housing matter to again, as I said, find new ways to support capital, right? Because in this affordable housing plan, actually is what we see. It's a view about how to create private-public partnerships, how to mobilize private investments, and how to support these investments by public money and state interventions, right? So it's like, and also the term affordable housing is quite blurry, so you don't really know what affordable means, for whom, compared to what. And we are afraid that, yes, this solution is actually only trying to hide the real causes of housing crisis and try to respond to the real estate crisis, which it's in this new cycle of downturn. So I guess for us on the left, would be important to. It's an important moment to speak about alternative solutions, and also for us on the left from East Central Europe, maybe it's important to give legitimacy to efforts to rethink the socialist legacy in the region in terms of housing politics, for example. So I obviously I'm not against new initiatives like cooperative housing and self-organized groups for cooperative housing. But I guess here in East Central Europe, we have many good examples of how non-profit financial institutions can provide finance for a mass production of public housing. So therefore, we should look for solution on this left political side in imaginaries about the future. And again, it's very complicated. Also, because we have to act at different scales. So local is not enough. National is not enough. So transnational would be crucial because actually the transnational global investment funds and developers are actually putting a pressure on political decision makers at different levels. So the question is, how can we organize on the left against these transnational economic actors who are very good in promoting their interests, which is capital accumulation and profit making.
And
so a socialist maybe alternative could be thought about. So housing movements on the left, I guess that should look for ways in which they can become part of internationalist socialist movements.
Yeah, thank you, Annika. That is a question we'll get back to later in the panel. But before we do so and discuss some other questions, I would like to ask Balint if he wants to add something to this topic.
In a way, that would imply that I know the answer about how housing could be put forward in nationwide political campaigns as a left, in a leftist framing. I mean, anyone who has been following Hungarian politics.
They're looking for possible solutions. You don't have to give the answer.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was just saying that everyone can tell that we have failed in this miserably in the past 15, 25, I'm not sure, years. I would say one thing though is that so many of the policy instruments that we mentioned or didn't mention yet, but for example, housing allowances, and I'm also replying, Ivans, to your thoughts about supply, demand, etc., how the market can take care of it. So a lot of the things that as a government or as a municipality you could do in the short run would have undesirable side effects, right? So rent controls is a prime example of how best you can manage to design certain type of rent control which would not create undesirable side effects, but even housing allowances or rent subsidies, if applied in a large scale, would end up being captured by landlords, as happens with the otherwise nice and decent system of the UK housing benefit scheme. So what I am hinting at is that it is very hard to aid urban housing affordability in the long run without large-scale investment in the public or somewhat socialized affordable rental infrastructure. So investment in the housing infrastructure. I mean, it's not, I'm not arguing against all the other instruments people are advocating for, including myself, or municipalities and governments can do, but I mean in the long run. So the reason why it is nice, why Vienna is a nice place to live, for the most part, is because they have been doing this, investing in the affordable housing infrastructure since between the two world wars. Of course, having several decades of social democratic rule helps. But what I want to raise, however, and now I'm reflecting on the Eastern European context, is that you have collective goods which are consumed somewhat collectively, like public squares and the railway system, schools, and even hospitals to a certain extent. And then you have collective goods which are consumed in a more private manner, such as public housing, I would say, right? And I think it is hard to imagine for anyone to spend the amount of money you would need to spend in order to significantly and in the long run increase housing affordability in Budapest or Kolozsvár, Cluj or Bucharest, while the collectively consumed social infrastructure is in such bad shape. So I think there is a trap in this way that it does feel luxurious. Like you could spend 50 million Hungarian forints to one public housing unit, and then you solve one household's problem for 20 decades maybe, but or for 20 years, but still. So I think there is this. I have this suspicion now that unless you would be able to somehow step up as far as the quality of the collectively consumed social infrastructure is concerned, it is really hard to imagine large-scale investments in the public housing sector, which are otherwise, historically speaking, happened in the whole world only in a very specific period after the Second World War anyway. And most countries live off of the investments of that period, which were not subjected to the kind of privatization, whatever could have been saved or were saved from that. So I think that's where we are.
Ewan, if you'd like to add something to this question, feel free. Or Cameron.
So I think these answers have been really useful in terms of the material considerations. I think the approach that we've taken is a bit more around the superstructural, where it's both of our main political parties have bought into these right-wing narratives, and the main conflict between them is whether you have the sort of development narrative where there's not enough housing because we haven't incentivized private developers to build enough housing, or you've got the nativist narrative, there isn't enough housing because the immigrants took it all. And that really limits the scope of what is imaginable within political discourse, particularly when the press is so tightly bound around that as well. So we have focused on building out what is imaginable through the consultation, as you had mentioned earlier, but also through particular campaigns around things that actually touch on the real issues, which are why there is such a limit to not housing itself, but the housing supply. For example, my neighbouring branch in Loch End ran a campaign around, I think it was 1,500 flats that are owned by the local council, but have been lying empty for years because they are in such a state of disrepair that they couldn't be rented out to anyone. So we had thousands of people living in hotels and bed and breakfasts at great expense to the council because the council couldn't afford to repair the flats they already owned. So they ran an enormously successful campaign around that and secured massive investment. The problem being that investment had to come from elsewhere in the limited council budget, which means that people are now being, council flats are no longer being allocated, repairs are no longer being made because all of the focus now is on using those resources to bring these flats back into use. So we need to continue building out that scale of what is imaginable and actually bring more resources into the sector. Similarly, in the Highlands, we have seen villages and towns effectively depopulated entirely because so much of the housing there has been turned over to tourist lets, because it is such a popular tourist destination and it is quite sparsely populated otherwise. We will see 30% of the housing being turned over to this kind of short-term let, which means that people have grown up in these areas, can no longer afford to live in them. And we're seeing these people moving from there to the cities where there is some housing still available, where there's work available, and a complete depopulation of these areas. So by highlighting these issues, we bring people's attention towards the underlying issues from a left-wing perspective. And using that, we're able to build anger around that from that perspective and build the scope of what we can pursue in order to resolve those issues.
So I suppose just a little bit extra on that, and maybe I'm creeping into the next question, so stop me if I am, is practically the way that we do that. I think Cameron set it out really nicely, is we start on the ground in communities, and we knock on hundreds of doors, and we set up stalls on street corners, and we visit local community cafes and local community centres, and we speak to people and we listen to them. And they define the issues that are affecting them and their communities. They define the solutions to those issues that are affecting them and their communities. And they then begin to organise their communities and build a campaign around that. Identify who has the power to change these things and go after them. And I think that one advantage and one of the things that we've seen there that has let us win some of these campaigns, you put your finger on it, Cameron, is I think that public authorities and national governments have for so long had pressure on them by the ultra-rich in our countries that and there has been very little organised pressure from below. But what we have seen is that when you can create that organised pressure, recreate that organised pressure from below, you can again get local authorities to put forward legislation or even national governments that can begin to improve the housing situation of people. So I think it's part of that. It's recreating that base, having them organised, starting off at a local level, neighbourhood to neighbourhood, building it up into citywide, building it up into national. And I think it's about that power to put pressure on governments to step in favour of ordinary people once again.
Thank you for these answers. Now I would like to move on to Balint a bit. So it's one thing how to gain power, but the other thing is what you do with the power. And of course, Balint works at the municipality of Budapest as a public servant, working on housing issues. So it's not like he's, working at the tax department or something. And what I want to ask you is, so you come from this activist background. You started housing activism like 20 years ago. That's fairly impressive to me. And you arrived, of course, to the municipal politics and to the municipality later. And what I want to ask you is, first of all, if you can just briefly explain your work that you're doing at the municipality, work you're proud of, maybe something you think that could be done better. But also, what I want to ask you is, does your background in housing activism and in the housing movement makes you a better public that help you as a public servant? Or does it hinder you? Or how can you utilize your experience in activism in your work as a public servant?
Yeah, so I mean, our understanding was, I think from the beginning, and in that sense, this organization was like a somewhat etatist organization, so not so much on the anarchist or council communist part of the scale, is that you need the state to be transformed from a machine or instrument of social injustice to a machine or instrument of social justice through egalitarian redistribution for the most part. And that cannot be done, that cannot be done without the kind of pressure from below that you guys have been talking about, of course. But it also, in reality, cannot be done without having people in the inside of the state and local authorities who are committed, so who are there to pursue this approach or these policies, and also who know the details of a certain policy field. Because otherwise, regardless of what kinds of commitments a politician make in a campaign speech, like if they just in the state or the department or that municipality does not have the kind of expertise and procedures and routines, etc., to implement those things, then it's just not going to happen. Now, I would also, however, stress is that having people inside who are committed does not make at all the kinds of pressure from below unnecessary. That's very important. And I would also say that the kind of activism and community organizing we were involved in actually made us, and of course now I'm also referring to another co-founder of the Cities for All, Tessa Udvarhelyi, who is currently the deputy mayor of the district you are currently at, deputy mayor of social affairs and participation.
And she'll be here tomorrow for a workshop?
Because and I was of course also doing academic work, and nothing that I'm saying is to belittle academic work. However, if the stake of your understanding of a legislation, for example, is not that your academic paper will be more or less accurate, but whether you can prevent someone being evicted or you can't. Like that's a much higher stake, which really forces you to be like really thorough and like really accurate and like really confident that what you think what's going on is well. And so I think that kind of advocacy, which also includes some sort of direct provision of legal aid, or the kind of lobbying and advocacy which is not at the level of abstraction that there should be more social housing, but like, okay, so this is our concrete draft law proposals on how the law on executions and the law on social affairs should be, codified. So like that kind of work, I think really makes you or allows you to be a better public servant, because you know the things you should like public servanting about in very, very close detail. This is one thing. And then another thing I would mention is that even though like our organization, it was like a grassroots organization without even like a legal form, because we were very suspicious always with the NGO industry about how then, you need more money and then you need to apply for funds and then you end up doing not what needs to be done, but what the funders give money for you to do. However, it was extremely well organized internally. And these detailed routines about how you do not call a meeting without having a prior agenda. You don't have a meeting without having taken notes, without identifying the tasks you discussed, the deadlines and the responsible people. Like, I know it sounds surprising that these kinds of skills can actually have added values in large municipalities, large urban municipalities, but they can.
Yeah. So basically, based on what Balin said, I want to move on to. I want to ask you, Annika, and also I think it's Cameron's turn, but feel free to decide which one of you will answer this question. And it'll be a short one this time. Is it better to be inside institutions, or is it better to remain outside institutions than fighting for housing?
It depends on how strong you are as a movement, I guess, and if you really see that there are conditions which would make you becoming a part of a majority in the decision-making institutions, right? In Cluj, we are far from that. So, and in Romania generally. So we will continue this activism for, as Balin said, increasing pressure from below. Our strategy in that is not only relying our own human resources and material resources as a housing activist group, but to contact other groups, which at their turn they could organize further, and this is actually how I conceive, to the increase of pressure, the increase of political pressure, by multiplying the political demands that the housing movement has through other movements. So I don't know if this is part of this question. What we try nowadays is, and actually we are doing it, we are doing a campaign together with a countrywide trade union. And the idea of the campaign is to show how housing crises affect all labor classes, and how the labor force is not only exploited by employers, but are also exploited on the housing market, because out of their income, which already created surplus value for the profit of employers, so how from their income they spend 30, 40, 50% on housing costs. And actually that's a form of exploitation. So this is how we try to create political pressure from below by raising awareness about these connections. And again, Barint is right. Maybe it's hard to imagine that there will be a political circumstance nowadays which makes us imagine that huge amounts of funds might be invested into public housing. But then I'm asking why, unfortunately, everybody can imagine today to spend public money on militarization. So that's actually one of the challenges of nowadays. And therefore, for us in the housing movement in Romania is also a stake, to connect to anti-militarization movements and peace movements. Because actually this militarization politics takes public money from other investments. So it's not only in itself a threat to the humanity, but it's also a way to distract investments from responding to people's needs, including housing needs, and to channel public investments towards wars and industries which again create profit for capital.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I want to have a last, and this time to please answer very quickly, question. But if you want to add just very quickly to this question of being inside or outside institutions.
So in general, we organize outside of institutions and identify places where we can place pressure on institutions, places where we can lean on decision-making mechanisms, and if necessary, kind of break them a little bit. You see, a lot of our decision-making is done at a statutory basis. So on a case-by-case basis, even elected legislators don't have a lot of they don't have a lot of discretion to be able to act like that. How long do I have?
Yeah.
Okay. So we had a campaign. So we had a campaign a couple of years ago against a student accommodation development, which we believed to be successful. But then the developer was able to appeal to a larger body that we had never even heard of, who overturned it immediately, and we had no recourse. So we kind of pursued twin policies then. The first was to change the underlying guidelines, which we recently achieved just this summer, as I mentioned earlier. The other was to effectively delay developments as best we could until we were able to achieve that. And one of the main ways that we've done that is taking advantage of the objection mechanism. Every application has a period in which people can object. We created resources and content to enable people to object en masse in a way which would be effective, to slow down the process. And in our own local campaign, we delayed by months and months. And as a result, these guidelines have now come in, and it's likely that will now be rejected.
Thank you. So the last thing I wanted to ask you is going back to what Annika mentioned, and please be quick, but you're here international, like we have activists and organizers and politicians from, I don't even know how many countries, and you're representing 3 countries here as well. So are you optimistic or pessimistic about the prospect of creating, as Annika has mentioned, a truly transnational left-wing housing movement to counter in the pressures of transnational capital? And please be like 1 short sentences long. And let's start with Balint and then Annika, and then you can finish.
Well, it is very nice to be able to meet with friends and colleagues and comrades from outside of Hungary or the region. And it is also very nice to have the possibility to learn experiences, methods, share. I think I am suspicious about the extent to which that kind of transnational organizing focus would fit in the first 10 priority of a contemporary Hungarian leftist or leftist housing movement.
Thank you. Annika?
Personally, I am a more pessimistic person, but now I have to be optimistic. Last week, I've participated in Barcelona on what was called the first International People Assembly Against Vampire Economy. And there were like 200 or more participants from 5 continents. And that gave me actually a hope in the strength of transnational organizing. And next year, what I mentioned about the European Action Coalition's Housing Day actually will become a global Housing Day. So, yeah, we should be together into that, even if we are aware of the limits of this potential.
Thank you. Yun?
I suppose the reason, after years and years of being on the left, the reason I came into community organising, which is what we do now, which is what Living Rent do, is partly because I began to grow a bit pessimistic about the idea of developing a genuinely powerful transnational kind of movement. And so I am still a bit pessimistic about that at the moment in the current context. But I am really, really optimistic about what we have seen and what we've experienced in changing things in a big way in our country. And that I think that if we can begin to link up these different movements that have a solid base on the ground of people who are organised and begin to link up, then I think I'm more optimistic about that kind of way of working, perhaps.
If anyone has a question from the panelists, please be brief and please actually ask a question. And if you want to ask a question in Hungarian, feel free to do so, and I will translate to the non-Hungarian speaking audience as well as the non-Hungarian speaking panelists.
I wanted to ask about the linking up of the movements and because I thought it was a very interesting point also about the anti-militarization and all of that. So maybe a question for those of you who are organizing tenants, how do you, if you're successful in cooperating the environmental issues in it? Because I've also heard about cases from people from Katu, from Dublin, that they had this kind of a dilemma when there were tenants who wanted to organize to have more parking spaces in the city center. So I don't know. So if you ever come up to the dilemmas like this, or how do you incorporate environmental issues in your organizing?
Thanks. I'm Szikra from Belgrade, from Machina. In your so far experience, did you find the role of European Parliament or particular, I don't know, persons in the European Parliament of any use? Thanks.
Thank you. And then Aram?
Yeah, I would have two questions. One to Ivan. How do you feel about, let's say, city council members or about the parliamentary politics? You have your respectable movement, but how do you feel that its effect on the politics in the Parliament, in the UK Parliament or Scottish Parliament, etc.? And I would have my other question to Bálint. How do you feel about the left-wing mayor's politics in Budapest, and about his politics about the Olympics right now, etc.?
Thank you. I think there is a question pointed at Bálint. I think the question about the tenants organization is probably most relevant to you guys. And Annika will answer the Parliament, and then Aram's first question, feel free to whoever wants to take it. So let's go in this order, maybe.
Thank you. I think there were two questions in there, as I understood it, the international sense and also the environmental kind of question. There are many ways to link up internationally, and I'm not saying that we have the only answer. But the way that we do it is Living Rent as an organisation is part of an international federation of tenant and community unions, which is called Acorn International. And it exists in many, many countries around the world and has done for many years. And it's growing fast in terms of the number of members in each country, but also the number of countries where these Acorn chapters exist. They're all autonomous, but they're part of this umbrella international organisation. And the kind of work that we've been talking about that we've done in Scotland is being replicated all around the world. And I think that's really inspiring. I think that links a little bit to the environmental question. The organisation you mentioned, CATU, is one of those. I said what brought me into community organising was a pessimism about transnational kind of organising, but I think it was also environmental issues and feeling like community organising was essential if we are to build up the kind of foundations of community resilience we need to tackle the climate crisis that we are now facing. And there's been some interesting examples within that Acorn International Federation about this. A huge one, for example, going back to the massive floods in New Orleans in America some years ago. And Acorn there, which were a very significant organisation in America at the time, hundreds of thousands of members, were key to rebuilding New Orleans at the time, physically rebuilding and politically rebuilding and challenging the authorities there. So that's one example, and I think one that could be a nice template, an important template for us to take into account in floods, for example, that we are experiencing in Scotland more and more now. Another one, just very briefly, in Canada, I know that the Acorn organisation there are working on maximum heat regulations. So they have pressured local authorities in different cities around Canada to put in place these rules where private and public housing can't go above a certain temperature in the summer. So there needs to be insulation, there needs to be air conditioning and so on. And I think that has had quite an important impact on people's lives there in that kind of housing.
I would refer to the European Parliament question. This year, together with a colleague from Greece, we made a study for two maps from the left and the Parliament, Claire Daly and Mick Wallace, and the study was published from crisis to cataclysm, housing financialization and the European Union. So in a way, yes, there is interest from maps towards this matter, but unfortunately, the political decision-making power of the European Parliament is too weak. there were several initiatives from that institution in the past 10 years. None of them were translated into legislative measures by the European Commission. So actually, yes, we would also need, if we think about targeting the EU institutions, we should think about a large reform of the European Union as a socio-economic union, and also, yes, to rebalance the democratic deficit in the European institutions. And in this matter, and I bought this brochure here. We also made this investigation about the impact of EU policies on housing and urban development. We did that work for Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Brussels office. And here we exactly analyze these, how even if the EU doesn't have a role directly in housing policies, actually it's through its economic policies and instruments actually contributed to the formation and reproduction of housing crisis and housing financialization. So actually a solution would need to go against this economic governance model of the EU in order to make a contribution to the solution of housing crisis.
Yeah, so as far as the usefulness of members of the European Parliament is concerned, I have very limited experiences of that. I mean, experiencing the usefulness of members of the Parliament. However, I do have some. So we did have a campaign and a conflict around mass evictions in Hajdúhatház, where the local authority gained some EU money to support people in deprived housing situations and deprived urban areas. And they wanted to use that money to execute mass evictions against the Roma minority. And because there was a direct EU implication, and also because it is really hard to find local allies in a town like Hajdúhatház, in protecting Roma people, because I mean Budapest in this respect is like a multicultural paradise, like a multicultural ghetto in this country of massive institutionalized and embedded racism and xenophobia, and so in that particular conflict, which in the end actually led to the prevention of the eviction of these 80 plus people, because you also asked me to say something we are proud of. So now I ticked off that box. Thank you. In that campaign, we did actually get some help from a liberal member of the parliament, Anna Donát, for which we are very grateful to her. And as far as the leftist mayors are concerned, because I had difficulties hearing your question, Aram, but did you ask about how I would evaluate the track record of leftist mayors? Yeah. Something like that? Okay, yeah. So I would answer in a roundabout way by saying that you are quite generous in describing anyone among the current mayors as leftist. So I think, we live in a kind of far-right hegemony that if anyone is in the right side of the fascism, anti-fascism, authoritarianism, like liberal democracy threshold, and also, does not cultivate hatred against minorities and poor people, but a decent person in general, like of goodwill, then we consider him or her a leftist, which is a quite low threshold, historically speaking. I mean, I also prefer these mayors, of course. I vote for them. I also work for one of them. But I don't think that there's much leftist incumbent decision-making resource as of now in Budapest. And And I think it would actually be quite important to have more, not only at the mayoral level, but also at the city council level, of which Aram, who asked the question, is a wonderful and inspiring example, by the way. You should meet him. So I would encourage Szikra in this respect to continue, which is a novelty in the Hungarian non-party left activist scene, to cultivate this understanding that we need to have committed people both outside and inside of these institutions.
Yeah, my name is Lee Andersson, and I'm sitting in the European Parliament, so I felt like called out by the previous question, because I'm also sitting in the Committee on Social Policy and Labour Market Policy, so where the housing kind of should be. And I think just to refer back to what was raised previously, there is more of an opening, I think, now for housing policies on the European Union level, because it's been pushed now as this new agenda for the upcoming term. And the way it has been framed, I think, also makes, people have expectations for the European Union when it comes to the housing part this time, because it's been so profiled. Even Ursula von der Leyen is talking about the housing crisis. But the big fight, I think, was exactly what was referred to here previously, that they're only talking about affordable housing when we should be talking about non-profit housing. Like, non-profit is the core of all of the working social housing models that exist in Europe. And now there's also this internal power struggle in the European Parliament, where they are trying to move out the housing policy from the Committee on Social Policy into this separate committee of its own, which in my opinion then would kind of make sure that this whole connection to wider progressive social policy will be cut. So it increases the kind of possibility that this will be like a market program. So my question then would be, what kind of support or cooperation would you then like with us and the members in the left group and in this committee, so that we now could work together to kind of push the housing policy back into the direction of non-profit, publicly owned social housing, and push against this strive to move housing even more into a market direction in the EU?
Thank you, Lee. And after Lee, it's Lily. Lily? No.
Thank you so much for this intervention. We think that it would be needed that in this political opening moment, institutions would be reminded about all the initiatives that existed priorly. So, and there were many also in terms of social housing and public housing. Also invite more radical housing activists to debate around these issues, because as far as now, actually, there are two big international housing organizations which are respected and invited by the Commission to the discussion table, and that is Housing Europe and FEANZA. So and they are much more close in a way and more ready to adapt to the Commission's governance models, So more radical housing activists around the table, and also the radical housing activists should also think about how to create pressure on that from outside the institution, not only because people usually are not so optimistic about these roundtables and debates inside the institutions. But actually, that's not role. It's the activists' duty, actually. You are right that this move from the social policy sphere towards economy suggests that the market-oriented and profit-oriented thinking will prevail in the forcing housing program. But there is also something good in this, because we need to be aware of the fact that housing is not only a social policy matter, but also an economic policy issue. So actually the economy should be changed, and economic governance should be changed in order to provide finance for public housing, right? So it's not because this is not just a matter of social right, but also way in which finance is produced and used in society for public good or for private benefit. So economic focus is good, but change should be made there. And thank you.
Just in bullet points, and also thanks for the intervention. I think it's nice to have good recommendations and declarations from the EP about what should be done about social housing and homelessness, but that does not really house anyone. I'm not trying to be cynical here. I also use those declarations and everything in my work. Szegény ember vízzel főz. I let Ivan to translate this Hungarian saying.
Poor people cook with water.
I mean, what is implied is that you don't have anything else.
It's you have to work with what you got.
Yes. However, I think in 3 points, because what matters is that what EU funds can be spent on, right? And so the EU should make much more effort in ensuring that EU funds are not spent on the further explosion, gentrification, exclusion and eviction of poor people, especially as far as ethnic minorities are concerned. The EU also should make sure that the actual distributive effects of spending EU money is egalitarian, which is currently not the case. It is not the case as far as the available research shows. And third, while the overall allocation logic of EU funds, which again is not effective in the practice, but in theory is all right, which is you want to create more equal conditions within regions, right? That's fine. However, housing affordability issues do not follow the same geographic pattern as the patterns of economic development, right? So, for example, Budapest, this region is the only region of Hungary, the per capita GDP of which is actually higher than the EU average. Everywhere else in the country is lower. However, the housing crisis, the affordability housing crisis is quite severe here. So in order to be able to address urban affordability crisis adequately, the usual allocation principle of relative regional development is not a good fit.
Thank you. So thank you very much for coming for this panel. We had to stop, unfortunately. But if you have not had enough of Ewan and Cameron, they are doing a workshop after the break at the 5th floor in the workshop room. So if you're registered, please head down. But if you're not registered, but you're really interested, there should be some spaces left for that. Also, the panelists will be around if you want to ask them questions personally. So, and after a 50-minute break in this room, we will be continuing with trade unions as the next topic. And I would just like to say a final word is that I think what Valin mentioned about hegemony is really resonated with me, because why we're here is to fight that hegemony and to create a laboratory for left-wing counter-hegemonic thinking and praxis. So thank you very much for coming here. Before you give round of applause to the panelists, let us give a big round of applause to all the volunteers and workers who are working on this event. I was looking at and seeing all these people around, doing this work. But please also give round of applause for our panel for Bálint Misetic, Enikő Vince, Ewan McLadden and Cameron Scully.
Thanks for tuning in. To find every other episode, follow our feed. This episode was produced by Levin Takatai. Thanks to everyone who made it possible.
Zengünk harang, veled együtt zeng a szívem.